Well, thanks everyone for joining. Uh, we're going to share. I'm going to share what I see as the accomplishments that the Idaho legislature and I worked together to really achieve some major wins for the state of Idaho. Obviously, one of the issues is funding for public schools, rural public schools, increased teacher pay, more money for literacy, and along with that is some capacity for launch going forward. As we see the success of launch, it's important that we have capacity in our career technical and our community colleges. On the highway side, we're going to bond for an additional $1 billion in projects. And they're scattered from one end of the state to the other. To do those big projects, really the only rational way to do for them is to bond for them. And then it helps the transportation department plan and get better bids on those jobs. We had a robust discussion about Medicaid cost containment. Legislation was passed there. A lot of that's going to be dependent upon the new federal administration and conversations we have there. Always structurally balanced budget. But let me focus today on two areas, the tax cuts and public schools. We've delivered tax relief to Idahoans every year since I've been in office uh, because it's the right thing to do and because the state of Idaho continues to grow. This year, we had property tax cuts, so families and seniors on fixed income won't be crushed by rising property values. Income tax cuts, so hardworking families can keep more of what they earn, so employers can put their earnings back into their businesses. And we adjusted grocery tax to compensate for the inflation that exists in the grocery area. In fact, with the tax cuts I signed this session, we've given back $6 billion in tax relief to Idahoans since I took office. Idaho has proven that we can give back consistently while taking care of the needs of a very fast growing state. Everyone knows that education's been my top priority. Strong public school support for families and communities is both our moral and our constitutional obligation to increase revenue and also for better outcomes. State support for public schools has increased 60% since I took office. Public schools budget was under 1.7 billion. Now it exceeds 2.6 billion dollars. Public school students are doing well, though we have more to do. We're seeing encouraging progress in overcoming learning loss from the pandemic, and our students now have more opportunities than ever after high school. Idaho is one of the very few states where post high school go on rates are going up rather than going down like they are in other states. And a lot of that is a result of our launch proposal. This session, we scored repurposed $50 million for rural public school facilities, an additional $85 million in increased teacher pay, and we had additional literacy investments to make the total for literacy $78 million so these kids can read proficiently by the end of the third grade. That nets out to a 500% increase in literacy funding since I took office. Public education has been and always will be a top priority. When I delivered my State of the State back in January, I told people that we would keep our promises and deliver on those promises. I'm happy that my legislative partners approved almost all of my Keeping Promises plan to keep Idaho on a successful trajectory. Together, we will continue to make Idaho the best run state in the country and promote policies to support public schools and families. With that, I'll take your questions. Yeah, Kyle. Sure. Well, the questions about House Bill 93. I, I, I proposed that in my State of the State. Uh, and uh, there was negotiations all along. At one point in time, there was very little review of how the money was spent. Uh, I think there was like one position over the tax commission. We got that moved up to six. And remember, if people don't comply with that, it's tax fraud. Most states don't have that. The other thing is we capped it. The other part of it was we means tested it. There's a certain level. If you have income over a certain level, you won't qualify. And then we overweighted it for disadvantaged students. Those were all components of what I asked for. I I would have done it a little differently, but literally everything I get from the legislature, I would have done a little differently. That's part of our constitutional process.
Are you having conversations yet with legislators about lifting that cap next session?
No, well, it's all relative to how our what. There's so many balls in the air about revenue for next year. What's the federal government going to do? What's our revenue going to do going forward? Those are all to be determined later. Yes.
Can you talk about why you signed the revised medical freedom bill?
Why I signed which bill?
The revised medical freedom bill after your veto?
Well, because the points that I, in my veto message, particularly that under most interpretations, most logical determinations, a school couldn't send a child home that had pink eye or measles or fill in the blank. They fixed that. That was, and really, there's no change after they sent back another bill. There's really no change in the policies we have. But that was the part that I pointed out in my veto message that, in essence, we've solved to where, you know, medical freedom does not mean that your children are at risk because somebody else perhaps didn't do the right thing. So,
Or do you believe that businesses will be similarly blocked in the bill, like they can't send home sick customers, employees?
well, that will obviously be determined. My veto was predicated on what it did for public schools. Yes.
Mr. Governor, February you spoke to some of us about some of the uncertainty at the federal level in terms of those cuts. I'm curious what you're seeing or reflecting on a few months later, in terms of such a large portion of Idaho's budget is dependent on federal funds. Looking last week at Pocatello, which is a 16 or 17 million dollar grant. What concerns you?
Well, the questions about the uncertainty at the federal process. I'm actually going to Washington tomorrow, where we'll be having those discussions. But the great big beautiful bill, I'm going to be keenly interested in what's in that. If we adopt the federal code, which we always do, except for one time, what's that going to mean for revenue going into the state? Obviously, a lot of these grants have been paused or stopped, but the money's still there, and so we need to see how the money gets reallocated. There's a lot of that taking place. I haven't seen anything that rises to the magnitude that it's something that we need to be urgently concerned about. There's some other areas, there's some small pieces of it, but it's still going to take a little while to find out what the magnitude is of some of this reorganization. But I can tell you that most people in Idaho agree that the federal government spends too much money, and if we think we're going to be totally immune to it, I understand, obviously, the administration and Congress we need to dial back spending and get this federal deficit under control.
As we're kind of piggybacking on that, as we're heading into wildfire season, a lot of the folks that do kind of the management beforehand were laid off. Is that work getting done in Idaho? Do you know kind of what the impact of that might be yet?
Laura's questions about the federal land agencies, Interior and Agriculture. There's a lot of changes taking place there. Matter of fact, I've got meetings with both this week about what's happening. There was an executive order that kind of ties with what we did here in the state. My firefighter, my fire task force, to make the coordination between the BLM and the Forest Service more efficient, and the coordination with the State Department of Land and rural fire districts, etc. Uh, I don't know of I don't know of any place in the state where they're saying uh, it's going to be a big crisis. One of the things the agencies do, not very efficiently, is prescribe burns. It's slow, it's inefficient. I have great confidence in the new Secretary of Interior and Secretary of Agriculture that they're going to work together to where we can get that done more efficiently. A lot of the problem is permitting. They make a big deal about a 100-acre uh, prescribed burn. There's areas of the state we need to be doing thousands and thousands of acres. But more importantly, we need to be doing the management that we need. And Idaho leads the nation in what we're doing in Good Neighbor Authority, where the federal government cedes to the state land department, the authority to do forest health projects, particularly around rural communities that are at risk of a big fire. So, kind of to be determined. Yeah.
Let's see what those, this is the committee that the legislature put together. Do you have any idea of what they're gonna be looking at, and what is your office doing, to maybe preempt what they might try to fix?
Well, the question's about Idaho Doge. My first reaction is, as a Republican, we've been in charge for 30 years. If we're inefficient, it's our fault. You can always get to be more efficient. And that is a constant process. That isn't something that just happens, on a one-time basis. But every single year, you should look at what you're doing to be more efficient. And I'm all in for that. But a lot of the programs are talking about the federal level and other level are programs that didn't even, that aren't even germane to Idaho. So we need to continue to be more efficient. We just talked about the fire, this controversy about who's in charge of the fire, the Forest Service, the BLM, or the state, or a local fire department. We need to smooth that out. But we can always be more efficient. And it isn't something we should do at a one-time basis, something we should build into the system that every year we get to be more efficient. Some programs have been around for a long time we ought to do away with. A lot of programs we just need to modernize and make them more efficient.
Governor, one of the bills you signed, the income tax cut reduced revenues by over $400 million. You said at one point during session, if you thought we could afford $400 million, that's what you would put in the budget. You still signed that bill, though. So how do you feel about the state's finances moving forward with that revenue reduced and the federal uncertainty?
Well, Logan, your point about the magnitude of the tax cut goes back to these other questions. I intentionally built my budget with a $200 million surplus every year in the out years. I remember the speaker saying, "Oh yeah, we can afford it," and he's exactly right. We can afford the $400 million, but the issue is where are you in year 2, year 3, year 4, about where we are. We've got about 22% of our state revenue in a rainy day fund, and I don't want to touch that rainy day fund because from my standpoint, it's not raining. We've got full employment. We're one of the fastest growing states. That is an instance where we need to be investing, becoming more efficient. And so my concern is about year 2, 3, and 4, and that's why we do, and no governor done it before us, we do 5-year budgets. If they pass a piece of legislation that goes to effect this year, next year, and the next year, I want to factor that into it. Am I going to have $200 million at the end of the year every year, knowing full well the economy is going to slow down, and then we'll be able to continue to invest, continue to do the right thing, particularly in the school area. And so that's why I didn't propose, but right now we're still about the fastest growing state, and if we can continue, we're going to be fine. But I just don't think most Idahoans think we ought to bet on being the fastest growing state forever. Yes.
One more comment coming off that, I think this year there was just the one veto in previous recent years there's been a couple more than that. And of course there's a political calculation in what bill we decide to sign, but I'm curious, but I'm curious how you thought about this year. Why there was a drop off in your features, particularly for bills that you see that you feel maybe could be saved?
Well, I don't get very many perfect pieces of legislation, and of course, perfect in Brad's eyes are different from other people's eyes. And but you know the health bill, the fact that that was apparent, and I really do want to thank the sponsors for working with us to fix that problem. And there's some bills that I sign them and I make a notice is let's see what happens in year 2, 3, and 4. I read an article today about the capital crimes unit. I remember reading that bill and I go, the fiscal note on this, and of course they didn't adopt the joint rules, so the fiscal note part of the process, but I am always looking in the fiscal note. And that goes back to the other question, is the reason I read the fiscal note is I want to know what the impacts are in year 2, 3, and 4, so that a piece of legislation that looks good today, all of a sudden you look at it in 2 or 3 years and says that's cost us a lot more money than we anticipated. I really want to work with the legislature to where what I view as a negative fiscal note, they view as a negative fiscal note. This is a part of the process that's gone on forever. Obviously, the governors think their initiatives have less impact, and the legislature think their initiative have less impact. We really are all part of Team Idaho. We need to work together so we know what those are, and then we need to keep updating our model. What's going to be the impact of legislation that's going to cost us in the out years?
The parental consent bill kind of update stalled this year. Was your office involved in negotiating that fix, and do you know why nothing moved forward this year, and kind of where we are now? Because the same problems that they're trying to fix are still there.
Well, sometimes, particularly if it's major legislation, it shouldn't be a surprise to anybody here that sometimes it takes 2 or 3 years to do it right. Some of it's, and one of the issues this year was the legislature, kind of the way they do the appropriations process, kind of the magnitude of legislation. There were things that maybe didn't get done that would have a better chance in a year where, and they're still getting their arms around their new appropriations process. What's a maintenance? What's a new program? And then legislative council just got behind, and they were a little slower than they usually are. I'm confident it'll be back next year. Yep.
We talked about a lot of different bills and issues today, but to you, what was the defining piece of legislation this session?
Well, obviously, one of the things in talking about out years is what I call the flywheel effect of launch. That these kids that are going to walk out of high school and go through a 12-month, 24-month program and make $4, $5, $6, $7, $8 an hour more than they would have otherwise. You layer that into the economy going forward, and it has so much value. This, all the discussions that are taking place right now on tariffs, we're talking about reshoring. You cannot reshore jobs if you don't have a more of a skilled workforce. So I think what we're doing, obviously, we need to continue to work on getting our literacy rate up. But these kids that now are going to have a pathway to a great living for a great career, I think that's the biggest thing. It was, my initiative 2 years ago. It only passed by 1 vote, but we've got it in the system now. Now we got to make it work. Now we got to work with everything from high schools, career technical institutions, private firms, community colleges. We did this event Friday in Twin Falls, 25% increase enrollment at CSI as a result of the launch programs. Brian?
Going back to sign a bill and see what happens. What do you think of the flag law?
And I supported it. I signed it. I was aware that it didn't have any kind of a penalty in it, I'm quite certain it's going to come back next year. So,
So how do you think it's playing out now? You think it's going to have to be settled in the legislature?
oh yeah.
Governor, you've served in the legislature before taking on this role. As we're talking about fiscal notes, about maybe not sure, knowing for sure what the effects of bills are going to be, do you feel like the legislature has the staff and the resources they need to be doing their job? Would they benefit from having, say, a dedicated fiscal analyst or something like that?
Well, I mean, the Legislative Budget Office has got, I worked there in 1976. In 1976, we didn't have Excel spreadsheets. Can you imagine when they change a number in the health and welfare budget as big as it is, in some agency, having to do that all on a 10 key? I was very bad at it, by the way. You know, the Legislative Budget Office, and as I stated just a minute ago, we want to work with them. The best thing for the people of Idaho is for the Division of Financial Management, my budget shop, to work with their budget shop on what's the best thing. And I don't know of a legislator that calls up one of my agencies and wants some information or wants to do something that we don't help them. So.
Speaking of fiscal notes, we were talking about House Bill 93. The fiscal note that the legislature voted on was pretty different than what the actual appropriation ended up being. Can you talk about, was your staff talking to legislators before they were voting? Because I know they were talking to the tax commission, so can you talk about why there was maybe a miscommunication about that?
Well, we always have disagreements on fiscal notes, have been around for a long time. One of the complicating issues is the House didn't pass the joint rules. So in essence, they're in the House side, they don't even have to do a fiscal note. But of course, when it gets to the Senate, the Senate's adopted those. But I just, and other states do different things with fiscal notes. They have kind of an independent commission that looks at it. I'm not sure that you get an independent, quasi-independent. It depends upon who appoints a quasi-independent. I think the best thing for the fiscal note is transparency. All of you out there, that when somebody says this bill costs this much, that the public, that the media, that anybody can say, and of course they've got language in the joint rule that says you can only challenge a fiscal note, which I disagreed with when they made that change in the committee. Well, those bills will change, but anybody can debate it anytime on the floor. But I see people stand up and challenge a fiscal note. Sometimes it doesn't move very many votes. It always gets my attention, but of course, I'm one of the only people that has to make the whole budget balance at the end of the day. Everybody else, whether it's their interest in agriculture or social services or education or fill in the blank, I'm the guy that has to make everything balanced, and so that's why I'm a little more anal about it than other people.
So
Can I say that?
With 93 specifically, were you reaching out to lawmakers, or were your staff reaching out to lawmakers to be like, hey, this isn't lining up with what the tax commission is saying they actually need?
Well, the tax commission, I had a meeting with sponsors, and I said, look, we've got to have compliance won't work if we don't have more staff over there. And I think initially there was only 1 or 2, and we got it up to 7. And to be fair, the first year is going to be, because it's a brand new program, first year is going to cost more. And I didn't have a problem with staffing it with more people and then laddering it down as the program went forward. So that's, but yes, we did have those discussions. But my staff is always working with the sponsors of bills. My staff's broke up to where they run the health and welfare and education, and so we're always having conversations about that.
Yeah, I'm wondering how you reflect on the dynamic between the legislature and the executive branch or your office this year compared to previous years. Do you see that kind of change?
you know, when during the heat of the battle, the last 30 days, you know, and there's all these things going on, and all of you guys are calling, and there's articles being written. But, you know, we take a deep breath, we get done, and say, what do we propose in the state of the state, and what do we get done? And then, subsequent to that, I travel and see particularly my Western governors and see how we did relative to those other governors. I always feel better after that. I mean, I was just in Salt Lake last week with Governor Cox and Governor Gordon of Wyoming. And they both have different legislators, they both have different rules. But all in all, I'm looking for wood. All in all, we get along in Idaho as well as anywhere. But there's just a national trend for the legislative branch, and a lot of what they're doing, and they even fess up to this, that a lot of what they're doing is something's going on in some very democratic state somewhere else. They don't want to come to Idaho. So I look at this legislation, I says, but I've been wrong a couple times. That's not going to come to Idaho. I think this is more important. They're an independent, constitutionally independent branch. They get to bring that. But I think that's part of it. I think people are concerned about what's happening in other states. And they want to build a wall around Idaho to keep some of those ideas from coming to Idaho. And I understand that. And it's happening everywhere. So. You must have a hard question. I paid that guy to drive by.
On literacy, you've seen this session and maybe the last couple of sessions, legislators don't want to spend more money on literacy until they see test scores put them on that. How do you convince the legislature that literacy is worth continuing to invest in?
Well, you know, like I said, we increased literacy funding by 500%. Give me a little truth serum, and I'll tell you that most of it went to pay for kindergarten, which is great. We know that kindergarten, paying for all-day kindergarten and helping these districts is incredibly important. But this year, the one line item that went into literacy is basically how do we take the best practices in the districts where there's big advancement in literacy and move it to the other districts. At the National Governors, Teresa and I were at the National Governors, and they had two speakers talking about how do you move literacy rates, and what we did in Idaho is exactly what they recommended. Find out the places, the communities where they're making the most advancement in literacy, and take that and apply it on all their surrounding areas. And that's what that piece of legislation did. Kind of the science of literacy, how you teach literacy. So I'm excited about that, but I want to get those test scores up and I work with the superintendent and the state board about, that's my priority is above everything, because the great equalizer in our society is those kids reading proficiently at the end of the third grade. If we're going to spend half our money on public education, kids ought to be able to read. Yep.
You mentioned you're going to DC and you have some thoughts on the big beautiful bill. Can you talk about what you're going to be bringing to the conversation?
Well, my thoughts are, what is it? What's going to impact Idaho? So I don't want to be in a position to where the big beautiful bill passes and myself and all my fellow governors are going to be back there whining and crying. I've said this many times. With what we've done in the past, where we are, almost anything that happens at the federal level is going to impact the other 49 states more than it is Idaho. And I feel that about the big beautiful bill, that because we've got 20% in a rainy day fund, because we've invested in our facilities, in our schools, in our roads, that anything that happens on the global economy, anything that happens coming from the administration, we're going to be in better shape. But I just think it's my job and my obligation to find out from the people that are writing the bills, whether it's funding that's going away or a change in the tax code, how that affects Idaho. Just my job as the CEO of the state.
How does Medicaid factor into this?
Big time. And you know, I talked here a little bit about what we're going to do in Medicaid. We've got waivers that have been there since 2017. HHS, there's a lot of those things there. I just a couple days ago got a report on how Idaho administers SNAP. We're one of the most efficient states, and that's one of the things I'm worried about. Is they categorically tell all the states we're going to cut your program by such and such. And I says, we're doing a good job. We've got the highest compliance rate, the least amount of fraud. Why would you penalize us because some other states, whether it's Medicaid, whether it's unemployment, whether it's LIHEAP, whether it's SNAP, because our SNAP compliance is one of the best there is. And that's not state money, that's all federal money. We're just doing a good job of protecting the federal taxpayer from fraud in the SNAP program.
So I know Congress is early in talks about what the bill's going to look like, but if there's any reduction in how much states get for Medicaid expansion, it's going to force Idaho and a bunch of other states into really tough discussions about whether to continue an expansion. Do you have any thoughts you're going to be sharing with the congressional delegation or other
Well,
officials in Washington?
you know, to me, it's how do we do Medicaid? You know, and defining the work requirement. The work requirement is going to be, and that was part of that legislation, was a work requirement. Simultaneously, we're going to put in managed care. I spend a lot of my time working with health and welfare, working with all the people that are impacted on what's going to, you know, that's going to be a $4 or $5 billion project. You know, because it's a federal share and it's a state share. I want us to be the most efficient. I want people in Idaho that are on traditional Medicaid to migrate up to the exchange or private insurance. I want people in the expansion population to go off onto the exchange and private insurance. And that's all requires a dynamic, thriving economy with good educational attainment opportunities so that literally the rising tide floats all ships. Medicaid is a direct result of that. But I don't think it's fair, and I'll make the case, that the states that have been efficient with the federal taxpayers' dollars get treated the same as the states that are not. And if I'm going to make a case back there, that's what the case is going to be. Brian?
I don't know if you're familiar with what's going on with West Ada School District, but teachers are resigning based on policies the district implemented, based on laws the legislature and you signed in the last few years. How do you feel about that? About kind of the top down and not so much local control?
Well, I'm a big, of course, every politician says I'm a big local control proponent, except you know, and they get almost all their money from the state. But one of the things I looked at all my state agencies and even in public schools, what's the turnover rate? You know, and if you look at the turnover rate, and that's why we need to continue to invest in our teachers, in their health care, and their retirement. But you know, look at the net. What's the turnover rate? Are there, you know, are there young teachers coming in? Are there retired teachers going out? I think they ought to have, you know, myself personally, if I was on the school board, you know, I'd want teachers to teach to the benefit of the students. But I know that there's controversy in a few school districts about it. But on the other hand, there's a lot of school districts that get along just fine.
Is this misinterpretation of the law or the policy, in your opinion?
It could be. Could be. Ryan?
Do you have is your office working on anything related to special ed funding that we could have?
Yes. Well, again, not last time or time before last, I was in the White House. The president called me out. Brad, don't you think you could do without the Department of Education? Yes, sir. But that's a big part of it because so much of our how are we going to get those funds? Are we going to get them with the same rules? Are we going to change the rules? And that's the issue on special education. There's so much action at the federal level on special education. I believe the state board and Debbie ought to be involved in what do we do at the state level about who qualifies for special education, how's it funded, can special education students go across district lines to where if you've got two small districts right next to each other and they both got special education students that need exactly the same thing, you don't have to have a program in District A and District B where they could, and it might even be a closer bus ride or ride to the other district. Those are all, there's a lot of dynamics in special education. We had to help those kids. My age, I was just at the point where we were mainstreaming a lot of those kids that weren't even in the school system. It's a great thing for our country. It's a great thing for our state that we protect those kids, but there's some efficiencies that we can get out of special education. We ought to look at the efficiencies, and then we ought to look and see how it affects every school district. So that's a dynamic part of it that I'm concerned about it, but I really want to know what the federal government's going to do on their part of special education, because not only do they send most of the money, they send almost all the rules. What's okay, Logan?
What was the biggest priority from your state of the state that didn't get done and needs to be at the top of the agenda for next year?
Probably my launch capacity. We got half of it. We didn't get the other half of it. For launch to work, we need more capacity. So that 15 million, well, I got the 10, but I really wanted the 15. Right?
I apologize if somebody asked this, but why are we here at this house?
Because I wanted you to hear the cars and the airplanes going over.
Is there a significance to taking this spot?
Because Teresa offered us to use her house. This is Zach Halge's. This is where my chief of staff was raised. So we wanted to go to Canyon County. We thought, what better, quieter place? I actually tried to get those cars to come by every time you asked a question, Brian, so I didn't have to answer your question. So. All right. Thank you.